Tonight, we won't follow soldiers into battlefields or kings into council halls. Instead, we'll step quietly into the courtyard of an ancient Greek home where the first light of dawn touches stone and the day of a healer begins. Here, medicine is not only knives and herbs, it is ritual, habit, and the steady patience of hands that know both prayer and practice. A clay jar waits like a silent companion. Bronze tools glimmer faintly in linen wraps, and mint leaves tremble in the morning breeze as if they too approve of what is about to happen. Healing in this world is half science, half faith, and always watched by the gods. So lower the lights. Let the calm of the courtyard press gently against your chest. And if your breathing begins to match the rhythm of a pestle grinding slowly in a mortar, that's just the night carrying you with it. If quiet journeys like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share the time and place you're listening from, perhaps the next lamp burning in the healer's house will be waiting for you there. And as the glow of that small flame steadies against the stone walls, you step a little closer. The courtyard is still, except for the faint scratch of linen being unwrapped, the quiet rattle of bronze against clay. The physician's day has not yet begun in words, but in gestures, rituals, so ordinary they become sacred. A pinch of barley at the shrine, a sip of mint water, the measured patience of hands preparing to meet the sick before the city wakes. A physician in a small Aegean town, or in a busy port where the fish arrived before the sun, would rise in the gray light and check his tools as if they were temperamental pets. A bronze scalpel wrapped in linen, a set of tiny hooks, a cup for cupping a mortar worn smooth by years of pounding herbs until they smelled like an agreeable forest. He would rinse his hands with water scented by crushed mint, because mint felt clean, and the breeze coming through the courtyard made the leaves tremble as if nodding in approval. Before breakfast, he might leave a pebble or a pinch of barley at the household shrine of the healing gods, a little insurance policy in the currency of gratitude. Nothing urgent, just a quiet habit like checking the door twice. He set out early because sickness likes the morning, or so people said. At dawn, villagers shuffled toward him with wool cloaks over their shoulders. Soldiers came with precise complaints, pointing with the confidence of men who had already named their injuries. The elite arrived last because comfort makes time expand like warm bread. He listened more than he spoke. The ear, he believed, was the physician's most polished instrument. Coughs told their stories in different accents: dry, wet, brave, impatient. Stomachs confessed through the gurgles that traveled across a quiet room. Some patients were superstitious about numbers and preferred to be the third of the day, because the third anything sounded safer than the first. The doctor obliged where he could. He had a wax tablet for notes. Nothing fancy, just names, weather, diet, and the odd remark like goat's milk disagrees with Minon's mood, or the moon was out early. The children slept well. One could say this was the first electronic health record if the electrons were bees and the record was a square of beeswax. His morning rituals weren't grand, but they were predictable enough to make the mind soften. He asked about sleep. He asked about stool with the politeness of a tea host. He asked what the patient ate yesterday and the day before, and what they wished they hadn't eaten at all. He watched how people stood when they forgot to be watched. A lame man looked straight, and a healthy man leaned. The doctor accepted payment in coins, or failing that in figs, or a promise to mend a fence, or a very specific cheese that came only in the spring. He had learned that people who pay in cheese are punctual. The sun climbed the sky at its unhelpful speed, and still he listened, because listening was half of cure and nearly all of courtesy. The rest of cure was touch, and a cup of wine diluted with water and a little good fortune. Tools mattered after the listening, and the doctor kept them in a box that had begun as a soldier's lunch chest and then became, by slow degrees, a clinic. The knives had small personalities. The thin scalpel preferred delicate work, like opening a boil with the gravity of a librarian trimming a page edge. The blunt hook was a shepherd of tissues, coaxing rather than pulling. A spoon-shaped probe found lost things inside wounds, like a careful ant searching for a mislaid hairpin. Beside the metal lay a bookless pharmacy, dried rue, fennel seed, crushed garlic, willow bark with its quiet bitterness that suggested it knew something about fever we didn't. There was honey for dressing cuts, because even then people notice that honey where it sits does not fester. There was wine for washing, vinegar for persuading stubborn skin to behave, and wool for bandages that could be washed and dried on a line strung between two fig trees. When he heated a cautery iron in his small brazier, it made a friendly ticking sound as it warmed. The smoke drifted up and disappeared into the morning like a thought changed to something kinder. Patience demanded technique, and also a little theater, because belief was a medicine of its own. He might begin with a compress, a poultice of crushed herbs pressed between linen and folded like a letter. If the patient shivered, he rubbed oil on their arms with long strokes to persuade the skin to stop acting like a nervous bird. Bleeding and purging had their place in his toolkit, though he applied them with the caution of someone lending a book. He opened a vein not to empty a person, but to nudge them, a small redirect, as if asking a river to take a slightly different path. He chose the spot by tradition and by observation, mostly avoiding anything that looked deeply important. Purging was reserved for stomachs that had announced their unhappiness for more than one day. He had recipes with polite names: the 4-seed drink, the Mao purge, the veteran's purge. Each came with instructions like a recipe shared among neighbors. When people asked if it would work, he said calmly that it often did, which had the advantage of sometimes being true. Odd cures traveled like sailors and sometimes stayed. There were little suction cups for drawing out what the body was reluctant to release, their rims greased with oil so they would cling like barnacles. There were fumigations for stubborn female disorders, in which aromatics were wafted upward with all the dignity of a priest at a festival. There were baths in tepid water, because warmth is a negotiator. A man with a headache sat with his feet in hot water, and a cloth dipped in cool water on his forehead, and nodded as if the water were telling him a story. The doctor liked the balance of opposites. It made his work feel like straightening rugs. He disliked harshness because it produced new problems as quickly as it solved old ones. If a soldier insisted on a drastic cure, the doctor would sometimes let the soldier count to 50 first. By the 40s, most men changed their minds. The philosophy behind all this was not complicated, but it was generous. The body had 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and these humors liked to behave, except when they didn't. Illness, said the physicians who had read the books carefully, was a matter of proportion and placement. Too much here, not enough there. A little like salt in soup. Hippocrates, who had a tidy way of writing sentences that every student copied like proverbs, taught that the best medicine was often time, watched closely. Rest, diet, air, and regimen rearranged the humors in ways a knife could not. He told doctors to stand where they could see, to keep their nails short, and to acknowledge the season, because winter and summer pushed bodies toward different troubles, as predictably as tides. On rainy days he blamed rain. On windy days he blamed wind. It sounds evasive until you notice that patients felt better when someone named the weather for them. This idea of balance seeped into everything, even the doctor's handwriting. He wrote slowly with a stylus on wax, and the lines he drew were very straight. He recorded the crisis days when disease might turn, and he watched for them like a shepherd watching the sky for the particular cloud that means actual rain rather than the promise of it. When someone improved, he didn't congratulate himself loudly. He nodded and asked what would taste good for supper and recommended something boiled. He advised daily walks, short ones, with hat, because moving quietly through familiar streets repairs many things that medicine can only salute from a distance. When a patient thanked him too generously, he said it was the regimen, which is the physician's way of pointing at the cat and saying the cat did it. Yet the boundary between reason and ritual was porous as a reed basket. In city sanctuaries dedicated to Asclepius, god of healing, patients slept in the holy precinct to receive dream visions. The doctor did not snort at this. He read the dreams like parables. A serpent licking a wound meant perhaps cleansing. A dog's bark meant alertness. A picture of the sea suggested the body needed either salt or simply a long story. He prescribed sacrifices measured in nodus units, a cock, a small cake, a ribbon, because expense is not a medicine either. He was careful, however, to keep rituals tidy. Smoke should drift upward, incantations should be brief. If a charm worked because it made a patient breathe more evenly, that still counted as working. When the moon was bright, he warned that insomnia would visit, and he adjusted expectations accordingly. People are grateful when a physician tells them that some nights are simply longer. When cures failed, the shadows lengthened in the house. It was not always the doctor's fault, and people generally knew that. They blamed the wind off the marshes or the gods, especially if the failure came suddenly and looked dramatic. The doctor stayed a little longer on such days. He sat with families and listened to the familiar liturgy of what-ifs, which have no ending but tend to arrive with blankets and bread. He arranged bodies and windows and soothed the room so that grief would not bounce against the walls and frighten the children. He left a note about the cause if he could guess one, but he seldom wrote the word certainty. He had certainty about very few things. The olive tree across the lane would bloom in spring. Fig season would arrive whether or not anyone was ready. And boiling water before dressing a wound made fewer new problems. Those were his sturdy anchors. Sometimes, though, he had to defend himself in the mild court of public opinion. Why had he bled the man? Because the face was flushed, the pulse crowded, the tongue thick with heat. Because 3 summers ago the same signs yielded to the same remedy. Because the man asked for it and calmed when the cup filled. Why had he purged the boy? Because the boy had eaten green almonds in quantities best reserved for goats? Why had he recommended walking around the courtyard 7 times? Because 7 laps take exactly the time necessary for a body to remember it has feet. The community nodded. They liked reasons, even if thin, even if they happened also to be little poems. The doctor understood this. He had learned that a physician who can explain the weather well is beloved. In the afternoons, he visited the barracks. Soldiers needed different care, bandaging done fast but not hurried, splints that could survive a march, bitter drinks that tasted like arguments but settled fevers by the time the moon rose. He was not a surgeon in the modern sense, but he could stitch a wound with tidy loops, and he could tighten a tourniquet with the detached affection of a sailor tying a familiar knot. He carried extra honey for the battlefield because honey travels with dignity. He taught the younger men how to rinse and wrap, how to turn a patient so that the lungs could remember what they liked to do. He praised water whenever possible. It was the simplest ally, and it did not send invoices. He ended days as he began them, with small rituals and smaller jokes. He cleaned his tools, left them in their box like birds returning to a roost, and wrote an account of weather, wind, fevers, outcomes. He recorded oddities that did not fit any neat pattern, a fever that broke after a story about a ship, the cough that ceased when the patient stood near time, the sudden cheerfulness of a man who smelled a slice of lemon. He was not sure if these mattered scientifically, but they mattered humanly, and in the evening the human kind of mattering is the easier kind to carry. He stretched his fingers and rubbed oil into his knuckles. He put the wax tablet away, and the sound it made soft, wooden, almost like a loaf resting on a table, was the sound of the day settling down. His legacy traveled farther than his steps. Later physicians copied his notes or pretended to. They adapted his recipes and threw away the ones that made wrinkles between the eyebrows. They took the humor seriously and also lightly, which is how ideas live the longest. Roman doctors who spoke Greek on market days taught soldiers to boil instruments and to tell their patients the truth without staging a drama. In distant centuries, apothecaries kept willow in jars because someone had once said it helped. Surgeons learned that honey does what honey has always done and wrote it down again as if new. A modern clinic may hum with electricity instead of cicadas, but even there, the best doctors listen first, ask about sleep second, and only then wonder which tool will make the smallest new problem. What did the ancient Greek doctor actually do all day? He walked and watched. He stirred and strained. He pressed cloth to skin and skin to sun. He arranged small things so that bigger things could remember how to behave. He moved the conversation gently from fear to food, from food to walking, from walking to sleep. He made the room orderly so that Hope could find the chair. He measured time in pulses and in shaded courtyards. In the distance, a kettle must be carried to cool, and the number of swallows that carved the air above a roof before dusk. When patients asked if they would recover, he often said, "Let us keep the regimen," which sounds evasive until you realize that regimen is a patient's way of being helped even when no one is looking. If you've reached this point still awake, you've now spent a day in that quiet world. You have watched the doctor balance knives with kindness, rituals with reason, remedies with restraint. The sun outside the clinic has lowered with almost comical patience. The brazier has gone from ember to ash. Somewhere a jar of honey waits under cheesecloth like a secret that was never very secret. The wind has shifted to the kind that closes shutters softly. The doctor's sandals lean against the wall. His wax tablet cools. If you're drifting, that is appropriate. The olive tree beyond the courtyard has stood for years exactly where it stands now. And in the morning, someone will check the knives again, and the mint will smell like clean water in a clay cup. And the first patient will cough in that careful way people cough when they would rather not. And the day will begin its slow, harmless work once more. You might not expect a man whose job is to pull ropes to have such firm opinions about candle height, but the monastery's bell ringer did. He stood in the cool dark a little before dawn and squinted at a stub of tallow, the way a jeweler squints at opals, and from this small inspection. He announced to himself that matins would begin in roughly the time it takes 3 swallows to cross the cloister. The swallows were rarely consulted, but they kept excellent time in summer. His bell rope hung beside him like a patient animal. He touched it, not yet, then walked a slow loop under the tower to feel the morning, because the stone coolness told him more about the hour than the candle did. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe for more of this profoundly untroubled clock watching, but please don't tire yourself with the effort. He took a breath that smelled faintly of old incense and wet limestone, and pulled. The sound went out into fields where nothing hurried. Matins was not a shout, it was a spreading. 2 pulls, a pause the length of a short prayer, and then a third, because tradition likes sets of 3, the way cats like sun-warmed thresholds. Lamps stirred in the dormitory. Sand shifted in the glass. Someone coughed in a way that meant I am awake, but I prefer not to prove it. The bell ringer wound the rope upon a peg and chalked a tiny mark on his tablet. Matins, still wind, stars strong. It was not necessary to write this every day, and yet he did, building a very small biography of sky and tone. He had learned, with the certainty of a person who owns exactly 1 ladder, that a bell sounds honest when the air is cold and sulks when the air is warm. A novice once asked him how he knew the difference between a sulk and an ordinary ring. "You will know," he said, "when the stone tells you." The novice looked at the stone, which declined to comment. After matins came the gentle geometry of daybreak. The ringer paced the cloister walk to where a thin iron rod gnomon was the pleasingly serious word through a shadow upon a scratch of numbers cut into a slab. In summer the shadow ran like a child. In winter, it moved like a reluctant mule. He adjusted the little peg that accounted for the season, a ritual that made him feel like a man turning a very large earth with a very small hand. Prime would come after Lauds, or Lauds after Prime, depending on the rule, the latitude, the abbot's temperament, and whether the geese had eaten the peapods. People think of monks as severe, but their clocks were full of softness. Hours were not 60-minute boxes. They were lengths of light with names. When the sun stretched, the hours stretched. When it shrank, the hours tucked in their elbows. On certain bitter mornings, he rang the prime early just to bring everyone to the warmth of the chapel sooner. And later, in the refectory, there would be a consensus that the bell had been correct, even if the sun had not. His morning circuit included 3 inspections: the water clock, the candle ladder, and the guest house sandglass. The clepsydra, a jar with a polite little hole in the bottom, dripped into a measuring bowl with lines carved by a monk whose knife had a wobble that gave the hours a gentle irregularity. Over time, the ringer had learned to love this wobble because it produced, over months, exactly the number of stories one needs for the long season when nothing happens but routine. The candle ladder held 3 candles with knots of thread at distances, determined by an earlier ringer who distrusted both astronomical tables and optimism. When the flame reached a knot, the knot did what knots do in the presence of fire, and someone would come tell him that a knotted candle had expressed an opinion. He would nod. In the guest house, the sandglass watched visitors who were not used to being watched by sand. The sand made a shooshing sound that sounded like a book whispering, which people found soothing until they realized it never stopped. By mid-morning, after terce, he became what the rule called claviger campanarum, which simply meant keeper of the keys to things that sound like bells and things that pretend to be bells. He examined the clappers, felt for hairline cracks with a finger trained to read metal like braille, and rubbed a little tallow on a rope that insisted on squeaking at the precise moment of spiritual reflection. Brass could be stern. Iron could be moody. Bronze, if cast well, behaved like a seasoned courser, warm, precise, and just a little vain. Tools for keeping this orchestra in tune were plain. Wedges of oak, a rasp someone's grandfather would have recognized a hammer that did not know its own age, beeswax surprised to find it towered in tiny leather pads for softening mischief. Once a mouse nested in the bell mouth. He coaxed it gently into a pocket because fright, he observed, travels up a rope faster than a signal. He kept small rules that made larger rules possible. Bells for the hours were single strokes with rests like commas. Bells for the chapter meeting were cheerful and urgent without being any sort of emergency. The meal bell had a rounder voice, a tone one might associate with soup. Work bells were practical, never theatrical. You do not want a rhapsody when it is time to weed onions. On feast days, the pattern was more complicated, as if the bell had learned a new word and wished to use it. He read the patterns in a little book with guidance like, for Saint Benedict, add 3 brisk ones after the last, and for Michaelmas, let the great bell enjoy itself. When the abbot asked what that meant, he said, "It means we ring until the bell seems pleased." The abbot, who had been young once, smiled. Because time was a shared project, the ringer also obeyed the measurements of others. The cellarer kept an hour for opening the buttery that corresponded less to light than to appetite. The gardener consulted a stick in the herb garden that cast a shadow onto tiles marked with herbs' names, which everyone pretended was scientific in order to be kind to the gardener. The infirmer had a water glass that ran a little fast and therefore made the 6 slightly earlier for everything, a practice the ringer admired. A visiting clerk once showed him a table from distant Toledo, suggesting a correction called the equation, by which the sun could be politely reminded that it was not a clock. He listened, nodded, and put the table in a drawer with other ideas that were clever and not very useful. The philosophy of his work was made of small sayings that grow in places where precision meets patience. A bell that is seldom rung rusts inside. The older ringer had told him, which sounded moral until you considered how many things it could excuse. If the wind carries the sound, pass the credit to the wind. On cold mornings, strike the first stroke a little lighter, or the bell will complain. He did not speak often of God while working because he felt that the bell already did. He preferred to speak of rope, pitch, and how a pause can feel like mercy. People came to him for the unofficial calendar. Lambing soon, based on the songs at dawn. Washerwomen tomorrow, based on the pails left ready. Taxes due, based on the treasurer's careful, tightened mouth. He knew these things not because he pried, but because bells make you notice patterns the way the sea makes a sailor notice the color of clouds. He also trafficked in facts that drift past most people in a drowse. Nones, despite sounding like 9, is the 9th hour of daylight, which in spring complicated lunches, but in winter forgave them. Noon, he liked to remind sleepy novices, used to be 3 in the afternoon, and then it slowly walked itself backward until it reached exactly where it lives now, at the center like a cat on a cushion. The word minute came from pars minuta, the small part, and then we divided the small part into a smaller small part called second, but no one in the monastery was in danger from seconds. Candles measured in inches promised one thing and delivered another because wax has opinions about drafts. A sandglass on a damp day took its time to be itself. These were not problems. They were character. When the bell aired, which it did, the consequences were domestic and educational. Once he rang vigils late on a night of fog and all the psalms felt like someone else's coat. Another time he rang the meal bell twice, an experiment that produced a memorable abundance of monks with bowls, and then he logged the outcome under the category research. Frozen clepsydras in January called for creative arithmetic. He would hold the clay jar to his chest like a cold cat until the water remembered its vocation. Wind could lift a rope and make an accidental peel. He told the wind gently that it did not have the proper license. And there was the spring incident of the stuck clapper, which he solved with the ancient method of tapping until the world aligns, a practice shared with cabinet makers and patient people in post offices. He kept a bench by the west door where tools and time sat together like old cousins. There was a punch for the rivets that hold a clapper's strap, a coil of spare rope braided with 3 strands of hemp and a strand of horsehair, to discourage mice with delicate tastes, and a tin of soft soap for the bell's wheel. He liked the words, gudgeon, yoke, crown. He liked that the bell's lip was called a sound bow, as if it were an instrument that had to be courted rather than commanded. He wiped the wheel after rain and listened with his hand on the bell to hear the after hum, a note that stayed in stone the way a memory stays in a room after everyone leaves. He checked the timber frame with a mallet, and the healthy knock said, in timber language, "We will hold." The ringer's afternoons were orderly, which is another way of saying they were soothingly repetitive. Sext, a bell for a short prayer and longer shadows. Work until nouns. The refectory bell with its friendly rub-a-dub that made the kitchen put ladles down and reach for bread. Sometimes he rang an extra little chime for visitors, just to help them feel introduced to the idea of time being different here. Children counted strokes on their fingers and always miscounted by 1, which pleased him. In haying season, he learned to pull with a rhythm that matched size. In harvest, he tried for something that resembled threshing. In winter, he aimed for wool. There is no science in this, and it does not need any. Occasionally, a dignitary arrived who wished to see the working of the clockwork that did not yet exist. He showed them the water jar and the candle and said, "Here are our gears," and watched them reassess both the monastery and their expectations about the future. Mechanical clocks were beginning to appear in big towns, contraptions that turned the air into a metronome, but the ringer felt no envy. He liked levers and cogs as much as any sensible person, But he also liked deciding that today the hour will be a little earlier, because Brother Martin's cough is worse and heat is medicine. He suspected that a machine would never make such a decision, and if it did, the decision would be called an error. When a brother died inevitably, quietly, as a candle ends, he rang the passing bell with long spaces between strokes, and in those spaces the world had time to notice itself. The village women paused with wet hands over basins. The shepherd lifted his head. The baker, who slept in odd installments, dreamed of flour settling like snow. Bells for death were counted by age, one stroke for each year, which made old men seem long and slow, even while being carried on short shoulders. He kept a chalk tally against the tower wall, not morbidly, just as a mason keeps track of stones. It reminded him that a year is both many and few when you hear it one note at a time. He also rang for weather. When hail gathered east of the ridge, he had permission to ring a small bell that sounded like someone shaking a tin of buttons. No one believed the bell stopped hail. They believed the bell told them where their children were, which is a different kind of miracle. In drought, the procession bell made a little loop around the cloister with everyone following and singing in a key invented for the purpose of persuading clouds. He preferred these processions in sandals because sandals do not argue with stone. In storm, the bell rope could slap the tower wall with a sound he disliked, so he tied it with a short hitch and sat under it like a man waiting for a friend to calm down. Evening came not like a door closing, but like a room dimming. Vespers had a hospitality the other hours did not. It welcomed what the day had been, even if that was mostly onions and rope. He rang with a few extra moments of resonance, and the choir entered with that distracted contentment of people who have located their place in a pattern. After Vespers, he climbed the steps to the belfry, not hurried, not slow carrying a small lamp, and a feeling that he had done enough to keep tomorrow from surprising anyone. Compline was soft, 2 strokes in space, as if to say, we will not belong to the beasts and the birds and the people who fold linens. As for legacy, he did not think in noble terms. He thought in maintenance. He copied his little book of patterns for the next ringer with discouragingly specific notes like, in frost, use the left hand more bravely, and, if rope complains, talk to rope. He wrote down the year the great bell had been rehung and noted the mason, who had patched the arch with a square stone that everyone agreed was slightly too square. He added a recipe for the oil that most pleased the wheel. In a margin he explained, perhaps too gently, that noon used to be nouns, and if any future ringer wished to be pedantic about this, the refectory was an open forum. He pointed out which sparrows insisted on nesting in the eaves, and how to negotiate this without scandal. And from this ordinary attention to rope and tone came things that outlived the names he wrote on his chalkboard. Villagers set their bread by his bell, and learned to call the meal in time to the second stroke. Travelers marked distances by 3 bells and a little, which turned into miles in the mouths of their grandchildren. A merchant once scheduled a bargain to conclude at the Bell of Nones, and, discovering that this could be enforced by public embarrassment, the village invented punctuality. Years later, a clock with iron teeth arrived, and the bell learned new manners. It did not sulk. It was introduced to the escapement and made friends. The ringer, now older, recognized that the old softness of time had become a fabric woven tight, and he was content because the fabric still held suit. If you're still with me, eyes drifting in that pleasant, heavy way, you can put your mind against the stone for a moment and feel how bells linger. The tower is not a tower so much as a long memory. The rope is not a rope so much as a polite suggestion. The candle lifts one more knotted inch and says the hour will be along shortly. Outside, the swallows close their aeronautical shop for the night with a neat signature on the sky. The bell ringer hangs the rope on its peg. He writes, just once more, calm. Vespers agreeable, and boxes the chalk. There is nothing left to hurry. The water settles in the jar. The sand quiets itself. The gnome's shadow goes wherever shadows go when they are done with speaking. Somewhere between one breath and the next, the day passes a small key to the night, and the night nods without words, and the bell sleeps, and so do you. You might not expect an ancient Greek doctor to start the day by arguing with a jug of water, but the jug had opinions, and so did he. The level in the clay pitcher told him things about the night air and the patient with the dry cough, and about whether to recommend thicker soup. He set the pitcher beside a tiny brazier, the way a careful person sets a clock, and he watched the steam think about rising. If you are still awake by the time we get to the precise ratio of barley to dill and medicinal broth, feel wonderfully free to subscribe, though honestly, conserving your energy is the healthiest choice. In the gray before dawn, he pressed a thumb against a beeswax tablet to warm it for writing, collected the day's reed pens, and stepped outside into a street that smelled like olive wood and last night's fish. He liked to count paces from his doorstep to the first fig tree. A consistent number meant his sandals were still trustworthy, and his joints were basically on speaking terms with the gods. Morning began with small, careful gestures that made the rest of the day appear as scientific, even when it mostly resembled patience. He washed his hands in cool water with a pinch of salt, and let the water fall over a smooth stone, because smooth stones do not complicate matters. He muttered a greeting to Asclepius, polite but not extravagant, then checked his instruments. A bronze scalpel that felt only as serious as necessary, a pair of bone, probes wrapped in linen that remembered every patient they had visited, a set of narrow tweezers that trapped the morning light and refused to let it go, and round mouths of cupping jars that kissed the air when he tested them. He held up his linen bandages and listened to them. Linen has a whisper when you pull it straight, and decided they would not do anything dramatic today. He sipped watered wine, because physicians who drink unmixed wine before dawn cannot be trusted with anything sharper than a spoon. And he did, in fact, own a very good spoon. The first visitors came with the soft noises of animals. A shepherd's boy with a scratched forearm and a goat who disliked fences. The boy learned to sit still because the doctor told him that bandages behave like honest citizens when they are not provoked. He cleaned the wound with wine that pretended to be an antiseptic and wrapped it with a seriousness that made the boy's goat consider a life of improved manners. Then a potter's wife with a heaviness in her head that arrived with the change of wind. He asked her about last night's sleep, and the fenugreek in her stew, because every illness to him contained either too much or too little of something: heat, cold, moisture, dryness, effort, rest, dill. He pressed fingers to her wrist and counted the pulse with the temple priest, sour in mind. Not because the gods kept time better than people, but because priests were hard to argue with at breakfast. He recommended a walk in the shadowed lane and a cloth dipped in vinegar if the heaviness returned, and he wrote it neatly on the beeswax tablet so he could admire later how sensible he had been. What people mostly wanted was not surgery. What they wanted was someone to witness their daily negotiations with the body. Villagers described their discomfort with fruit metaphors if they were poetic, and with weather metaphors if they were farmers. A fisherman said his knees felt like nets left in the sun. A baker said his stomach was dough that rose too high and then fell sadly at the edges. The doctor agreed the way a tide agrees with a shore. He suggested the necessary dullness, fewer figs for a while, more barley water, sleep when the moon is not busy, breathe where the wind crosses the temple steps, avoid shouting at midday. He could, if pressed, set a bone with splints of reed and wool, but even that he tried to schedule for late morning, when bones are most reasonable and neighbors least theatrical. He kept his bag light because dignity travels better that way. The bag held salves in small ceramic cups, a mortar and pestle that liked to be. Dizzy small rolls of lint torn from exhausted tunics and knots of string for measuring, because to the Greek doctor of finger width was an excellent unit when used by the same finger every day. He collected stories as he walked. A man who swore his cough improved when he slept on the roof. A woman who said the sea cured her melancholy if she looked at it sideways. He filed these with the precision of a physician who knows the world is largely anecdotal, and that anecdotes often eat breakfast before facts. His tools were unassuming and persistent. The brown scalpel took a new edge from a whetstone and, in gratitude, cut only what was introduced to it with ceremony. Probes tapped lightly at swellings and listened for the hollow echo of trapped wind. Sometimes, if you paid attention, a swelling lied about its contents, and the probe caught the lie like a stern aunt catches a fibbing nephew. The cupping jars were warmed over the brazier and then placed upon a back like small moons, settling on a landscape. They left perfect circles that convinced the patient an event had occurred, which is sometimes indistinguishable from a cure. Cautery irons lay in a row like well-behaved snakes, to be used when the body needed a firm period at the end of a wandering sentence. He handled them as if they were letters in a heavy alphabet, because they were and practiced the ancient grammar of stopping. People remember the dramatic instruments, but most days belong to quiet items. The folded compress, the queen, wool sprigs of dried oregano, tied with thread for steams. A length of ribbon to bind a jaw after tooth extraction, because wisdom teeth were not in fact wise. He kept splints of fig wood for fingers, reeds for wrists, and a clever little sling for elbows built from a triangle of cloth and a good opinion of triangles. He owned this delighted schoolboys a small ear spoon carved from bone, with which he removed the stubborn stories that ears told themselves over time. In a shelf god's niche he kept rolled scrolls, on fractures, which contained elegant ways to tell ordinary bones what to do, on joints which had the reassuring tone of a man who has met most joints personally, and on airs, waters, and places a reminder that illness sits not merely in bodies, but also in whichever wind is in the mood to visit. Treatments could be plain or odd in the proportion that best suited the patient's willingness to be comforted. Bleeding was a method he considered with the calm of a man reaching for a small knife to peel an apple. Too much blood or too vigorous might be asked politely to leave through a vein at the elbow. He counted drips the way a poet counts his syllables. Purging, on the other hand, requested that the body recite its mistakes, upward or downward, depending on the prescription for confession. A pinch of white hellebore from Antikyra was famous for persuading stubborn stomachs to remember their duties. Go to Antikyra was the proverb for anyone overly certain of himself. He blended emollients from olive oil and beeswax in correct fractions that made the skin feel respected, and he brewed teas from chamomile, rue, or fennel, according to whether the complaint was hot, cold, dry, or wet. If you're pondering whether heat can be wet, you are welcome to join physicians across centuries who discuss damp fevers while nodding as though they understood. He also performed procedures that lived in the soft space between bravery and habit. A dislocated shoulder could be persuaded to cooperate with a pulley made of rope, and a friend who was strong and had an uncomplicated conscience. Abscesses were opened with a quickness learned from opening figs at their seam. The analogy was not accidental. He sometimes used a reed catheter on those who could not pass urine, and treated it as a matter as practical as finding his stuck cork in a jug. He reduced fractures with the kindness of a patient man folding linens. He did not believe in pain for its own sake, which made him almost modern if you tilted your head and let forgiveness into the definition of modern. Behind the tangible work hummed ideas as repetitive and as quietly persuasive as waves. For humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile took turns behaving themselves. When one misbehaved, it recruited weather, food, sleep, and mood to its party, and the patient arrived at the door with a look that said the guest list had gotten out of hand. The doctor's job was to send the unruly humor home early without insulting the others. He believed in balance the way a careful shopper believes in weighing olives. not as a metaphysics, but as a daily practice. He weighed days of labor against evenings of talk. He weighed heavy dinners against cool mornings. He believed, and could explain at length to anyone who nodded in the correct places, that autumn diseases differ from spring diseases in the same way pomegranates differ from pears, agreeably and inevitably. He kept notebook thoughts that spilled into life. On certain island wines, for example, coughs lengthened, and the elderly asked for chairs earlier in the day. In cities with marshy air, fevers came like tourists and refused to leave, which required patient regimens and more stories than medicine. In mountain villages, injuries were clean and spectacular. In port towns, they were small and consequential. He wrote that babies born when the north wind slept often had warm foreheads and strong opinions. And he knew this was not strictly medicine, but he also knew people like being seen in the round. Of course, medicine never stayed entirely still. Across the square stood the temple of Asclepius, and the priest there had a different approach to evidence. The doctor walked by in the evenings. He enjoyed the rituals like a calm spectator at a weather show. Pilgrims slept in the Abaton and reported dreams in which the god or sacred snake suggested a cure, a spring to bathe in, a diet of cheese, the laying on of paws by a temple dog with unassailable credentials and kindness. Votive tablets Ayamada declared the marvels in tidy lines. A blind man saw, a lame woman walked. A nail in a foot went out the way nails prefer not to. The doctor did not argue. He thought of these cures the way a sailor thinks of favorable currents, useful and not to be provoked with excessive talk. He noted gently that the temple's spring water was very clean and the sleeping platform encouraged rest, and he prescribed rest and cleanliness with a smile that made friends of both the priest and the patients. Between his scrolls and the sanctuaries lay a path walked smooth by people who wanted both herbs and miracles in the same week. On days when his remedies failed, and they did, because bodies are greater than books, he practiced a careful distribution of blame that kept the town from fraying. It was sometimes the weather's fault. Weather accepted blame gracefully and changed the subject. It was sometimes the patient's schedule, which had contained too many figs, too much wrestling, or a donkey with feelings about stepping stones. At other times, the doctor would put his hand over his heart and say the humors were stubborn this season, as if the year itself had gotten into a mood. Priests, too, shared in the economy of causation. An ill-placed oath, a neglected offering, a god not properly thanked. Oddly, this spread of explanations tended to preserve friendship. When accountability is everywhere, it is nowhere in particular. Can people go on eating dinner together? He was an expert in failure's rituals. After a hard night when a fever climbed like ivy despite every cooling cloth, he sat with the family and counted breaths softly to prove that time still had a rhythm. He recommended rosemary under the pillow for those left behind, not because rosemary has measurable grief medicine, but because it smells like a clean room that has recently been put in order. He wrote death on his wax tablet with the same hand that wrote remedies and did not find the contrast theatrical. He washed his tools, then washed them again, then set them in sun that had opinions about purity. He did not disgrace the sun by disagreeing. Between such nights came long afternoons of teaching that were almost comically thorough. Students more enthusiastic than necessary asked whether black bile was literally black. He said no and yes, because the truth did not know which answer it preferred. They asked how to recognize good pus, and he said that a body's arguments leave a trace that looks like conversation settled. They learned bandaging the way one learns poetry, one phrase at a time, pulled snug, but not taught, patient as an alphabet. He made them smell fevers, because fevers each have their kitchen, a sourness here, a bread dough scent there. He made them look at tongues and at the rims of eyes, at nails and the spaces between the toes where sweat keeps its diary. He asked them to keep diaries too. When wind changed, when swallows circled low, when rain argued with dust. The notes filled shelves with the pleasant illusion of control. Legacy did not arrive with trumpets. It arrived with apprentices who grew into physicians who wrote in their own tidy hands. He copied bits from his scrolls into theirs, and sent them to cities where people had slightly different coughs and significantly better olives. Soldiers borrowed him during campaigns because armies are enthusiastic factories of fractures, and he discovered that battlefield surgery is 1 part courage and 3 parts cleanliness when there is any to be had. He learned how to bind torsos with belts and cloaks, and how to carry wounded men in litters without making their bones rethink recent decisions. When he returned home, he added straps to his practice in town, and invented a clever loop for lifting a leg without angering its owner. He wrote those loops down and felt, in a small way, that he had tucked a quiet ribbon of knowledge into the world's lap. From all this ordinary attention flowed habits that would invisibly and stubbornly survive him. The insistence on washing hands, even when water was cold and nearby conversations were interesting, became customary. The way he asked patients what they ate and where they slept turned into a model of taking histories, which is really a model of listening to how people arrange their days. His bandaging lessons, his practical love of triangles and figure eights, stayed in shoulders and ankles long after names faded from stones. Even his personal eccentricities, the way he knocked twice on a doorway before entering a sick room to wake the air, or the way he measured a fever by breath count while looking sideways so the patient could own the number, became techniques without the story. Near sunset, he sat on a low wall and wrote nothing at all. This was as important as writing because the mind sorts itself if left alone in the company of evening. Children chased a hoop down the lane, and he noted, a doctor cannot help it, that the boy with the hoop favored his left foot. He would grow into a fisherman who tied knots faster than average. A woman called to a neighbor about parsley, which in summer was medicine and in winter was advice. The priest closed the temple doors but left the courtyard open to the sky, which was the truest prescription anyone kept. The brazier in his doorway cooled with gentle dignity. He stacked his instruments in a clean cloth. Not reverently, reverence is a little loud for tools, but with the respect you give to objects that keep secrets for you. If you drifted somewhere between the hellebore and the shoulder pulley, that is an acceptable outcome. The physician himself drifted sometimes in the afternoon, waking only when a client stood in the doorway, and coughed in a manner that suggested both politeness and plague. He would rise, smooth his tunic as if smoothing time, and begin again with the cool water, the salt pinch, the linen's whisper. He would ask what was eaten and how and when. He would measure a forearm with his thread and consult the wind with his face. He would listen to the body's speech and answer in the dialect of balance. The city would dim and the goats would reconsider fences. Somewhere a votive tablet would receive a new line about a god who fixed a knee in a dream. Somewhere a student would memorize a bandage the way one memorizes a lullaby. The doctor would write one last note on his wax, breezes from the west. Barley broth preferred. Sleep advised. Then he would blow out the lamp and place the day, folded, on the shelf with all the other folded days, where it would continue healing anything that could be healed by the pleasant, uneventful persistence of care. You might not expect a healer to spend the first quiet minutes of dawn counting how many breaths fit between the drip of a clay water jar and the creak of a wooden hinge, but that is exactly the sort of measurement an ancient Greek doctor trusted. It was as accurate as the stars and easier to check before breakfast. He rubbed sleep from his eyes with the back of his hand, then checked the brazier, which held a coal the color of a pomegranate seed, still capable of convincing a cup of wine to call itself warm. If you were still awake by the time I explain why he argued with wind direction before he put on his sandals, feel very free to subscribe, or better, let the subscription float away like steam from that cup and drift back tomorrow when it remembers what it was doing. He began his day the way a scribe begins a letter, with tools chosen for the tone he hoped to set. The bull's water had sat all night under a sprig of laurel, only because laurel looked like it knew Latin, which was impressive in a world that had never heard of Latin. He rinsed his hands and wrists to the tune of a little prayer that mentioned Asclepius, Hygeia, and, for safety, any local river that might be listening. The small iron lamp received 2 drops of oil, number 3. 3 felt dramatic, and the room accepted the light without comment. He looked at his reed pens, though he had no intention of writing, yet the way a baker reviews his loaves while the oven warms, and he set aside a beeswax tablet to take notes later about anyone whose cough had a personality. He tied his belt in the middle, because belts in the middle tell joints to behave, and he stood in the doorway to taste the air. Doctors of his kind could tell you, with almost scientific certainty, whether today's fevers would prefer to be dry or damp, just by letting the morning sit on their tongue for a breath or 2. The first footsteps usually belonged to people who believed illness respected sunrise. A farmer arrived with straw, still negotiating his hair, bringing his daughter, whose ankle had folded under her like a closing fan. The doctor set a low stool in the patch of light at the threshold and asked questions as simple as bread. Where did you step? What did you hear? What did the ground say back? He stroked the swelling with fingers that had learned the difference between a joint offended and a joint merely confused. Thick wood splints waited under a cloth like shy soldiers, and he wrapped them with linen soaked in watered wine, because wine had a way of making tissues listen. He taught the girl to place her heel on the floor as if it were a polite guest, and her toes as if they were thinking about the future. She nodded carefully, the way people nod when they suspect the instructions are slightly poetry. After the farmer came a soldier whose shield had argued with his shoulder. The doctor knew this type. Brave at noon, rueful at sunrise, eager to return to being brave by noon again. He sat the man on a bench and looped a soft strap around the arm to show the joint the path it had forgotten. There is an exact sound a shoulder makes when it agrees to be a shoulder again. It is something like a jar lid remembering itself. The soldier grinned with the humility of a man who has just met physics personally. The doctor wrote a note on the wax. Shoulder. Agreed. Do not lift amphorae to impress neighbors. He signed it with the smallest flourish, as if to apologize to the alphabet for using it so early. His rounds took him from doorways that smelled of fish to courtyards that smelled of time. In one house, a young wife had a fever that liked to be discussed, and he leaned close to the pulse at her wrist, not because pulse measurements were new, but because they are always new. He counted heartbeats against the drips from the eaves, let the numbers settle until they looked like a pattern, and then asked the practical questions: what she had eaten, how she had slept, whether the breeze came from the sea or from the vineyards, whether her neighbors' children had been generous with their sneezes. He recommended barley water warmed with a sliver of cinnamon if the family could afford pretension, and if not, he prescribed shade. Shade, in his view, was medicine wearing a tree. He carried a bag that never looked heavy but always solved problems. The bronze scalpel lay in a narrow sleeve, proud but not showy, its edge maintained by a stone that gave good advice. Bone probes smooth, almost friendly, tapped gently at hollows and swells to ask questions the skin couldn't answer. Cupping jars waited for their turn to be important, their mouths round as little moons. When warmed and placed on a back, they rose and left dignified circles like seals on a document that said, "We did something here." He had tweezers that could pluck a splinter from a skeptic. He had a cautery iron that he used so rarely it grew lonely, and therefore never took offense when brought to work. There were bandages in neat rolls, the edges tucked in with the same pleasure he took in making a bed correctly. He carried lint wound from old linen, because old linen knows the body already, and therefore comforts it faster. Sometimes the work asked for a little theater, and he obliged with the calm of a man folding a map he knows by heart. Bleeding was one such performance, conducted as carefully as trimming a vine. He tied a soft ligature above the elbow, found a vein that suggested cooperation, and let a measured amount flow into a shallow bowl. He counted drops softly, as if they were sheep in reverse. Too many drops were a mistake, too few a missed opportunity, and in either case, the patient learned to read the doctor's face like a horizon. Purging had its own ceremonies. A small dose of white hellebore from Antikythera, praised by proverb and feared by breakfast, persuaded the stomach to hold a frank discussion with the world. Flatulence was relocated with fennel tea, and a walk taken at the speed of a thoughtful tortoise. For coughs he favored hyssop, honey, and patience, and he told coughs aloud sometimes that their time in the house was limited by civic decree. Beneath the routines lay a philosophy simple enough to memorize and complicated enough to justify a lifetime. The body, he believed, is a market where four traders, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, argue about prices. When one shouts, the others sulk. A doctor, then, is a polite official who walks the stalls and encouraged moderation. More water here, less heat there, sleep sooner, work later. Add dill to balance the onion's mood. Hot illnesses prefer cool remedies, wet illnesses dry ones, and most illnesses prefer to be observed into better behavior. He kept a mental ledger of counterweights. Vinegar to wine, barley to lamb, figs to restraint, baths to pride, naps to philosophy. Patients who wanted drama, he sent to the temple for an impressive dream. Patients who wanted a plan, he sent home with instructions that called themselves ordinary. He did not mind the temple. In the sanctuary of Asclepius, the faithful slept with snakes that had excellent public relations, and in the morning they reported cures engraved on votive tablets. A lameness walked away, an ear opened, a stone passed like wisdom. The doctor nodded at these as he passed, not irritated, only interested. He knew that quiet, a clean bed, and a priest who believes in you are three of the finest medicines anyone has invented. When people asked which to choose, trolls or sacred dreams, he recommended both, like someone suggesting soup and bread without implying that one is insufficient. He had noticed that a patient who feels visited by the divine will sip barley water with better manners. When treatments failed, the city adjusted itself around the failure the way a cloak settles after a gust of wind. Families sat together and let candles say the necessary things. The doctor gave grief its tasks: wash the body with warm water, comb the hair, place a sprig of rosemary in the hand, tell the story of the best day the person had last summer. He did this because tasks are small boats on big rivers. He cleaned his instruments twice because even bronze likes apologies. He then sat with his own notebook and wrote the weather, the number of breaths, per minute the color of the tongue, and the hour the fever turned its face away, as if noting these facts would one day persuade a different fever to negotiate. Between such nights came long afternoons of study disguised as gossip. Students arrived more awake than necessary and whispered the words they had just learned: phlebotomy, cataplasm, prognosis. He taught them to wrap a bandage so it looked uninterested in unraveling. He made them taste the air and tell him whether it promised damp hands by noon. He showed them how to smell a wound and know whether it intended peace. He let them place their ears against chests and learn the low thunder of lungs that behaved, and the thin reed sound of lungs that would consider behaving if shown an ice blanket. He asked them to memorize the do-nots that outlive physicians: do not hurry a bone, do not argue with sleep, do not attempt surgery when hungry or proud. He wrote his scrolls as if they were travel guides to a country that changes borders with the seasons. On fractures read like an extended letter to wrists about etiquette. On joints used metaphors shamelessly: knees as door hinges, shoulders as cranes, ankles as diplomats who negotiate the peace between ground and ambition. On airs, waters, and places, insisted that diseases collect like gossip in low, damp neighborhoods, and that mountain towns give people chests shaped like good amphorae. He loved these theories because they connected the cough on a doorstep to the wind over a hill. Even when they were wrong, they were beautifully, hopefully wrong. His practice expanded wherever people crowded themselves and then regretted it. In a siege, he learned to cut through armor's memory and find the living man beneath its purchase. He discovered that battlefield medicine is 90 parts cleanliness and 10 parts song. The song used to distract a frightened person from their own heroic inventory. He invented, or at least refined, a sling for carrying a leg as if it were the last egg of spring. When he returned home, he brought these contrivances with him, and the townspeople laughed at the straps until they needed them, and then praised the straps for their inventiveness, the way people always do. At times, he mixed science with superstition, the way bakers mix honey with barley, not because either requires the other, but because together they are easier to swallow. He recommended amulets against certain headaches, explaining that silver comforts a certain kind of pain, which may be true of silver and certainly true of comfort. He approved of bay leaves under pillows for prophetic dreams before big decisions, not because the leaves know the future, but because a person who organizes their leaves before bed is less likely to make a foolish choice in the morning. He watched eclipses without fear, but advised pregnant women to sit during them, a compromise between cosmic indifference and domestic harmony. Micro-decisions filled his days like sesame seeds on bread. To open an abscess or persuade it quietly. He chose based on how stubborn the pus looked, which is a judgment one can learn. To bleed a vigorous man in August? Perhaps not. He already sweated his arguments. To recommend a bath? Yes, but not so hot that the skin forgets itself. To set a fee? A little for the rich, nothing for the widow. A jar of olives for the shepherd who could spare only the olives and the story of how he grew them. He liked the stories better than the coins, and he kept them in his head where the coins could not rust. The city recognized him by the way he paused before thresholds, as if asking the house whether it preferred hope today or reassurance. Children greeted him with questions about earwax, a subject upon which he was unflappably expert. Old men greeted him with their wrists extended, ready for a pulse to confirm what they already suspected, that they were still here in the exact number of beats the morning required. Young women asked how to sleep, and he prescribed an evening walk and a list of what went well that day, to be written or spoken aloud or merely admired in the mind like laundry folded while still warm. Sailors asked about seasickness, and he suggested looking at the horizon as if it were telling a slow joke. Wrestlers asked about bruises, and he suggested arnica if it grew nearby, and otherwise time, which grows everywhere. He navigated blame with the diplomacy of a man who must keep eating in the same town where he practices. When a remedy helped, he praised the patient for following directions with discipline bordering on poetry. When a remedy failed, he praised the patient for trying and blamed the wind, or new moon, or the year, which had arrived with ideas. If the priest claimed a miracle, he nodded and trimmed the patient's bandage with professional economy. If a neighbor recommended a poultice of mashed snails and regret, he smiled and said that any poultice applied with love has a chance. The legacy he left behind did not look like a statue. It looked like repeated gestures that continued after he slept. A hand washing before entering a sick room. A doctor bringing a stool to the edge of the bed and sitting, which is the posture of listening that all good medicine shares. A student noticing the wind before diagnosing the cough. A mother who knows how to wrap a sprained ankle with a strip torn from a clean sheet and a blessing spoken under her breath. A soldier who recognizes the sound of his shoulder returning and does not panic. The next generation copied his scrolls and, unable to resist, corrected him, which is how grateful people disagree. When the sun leaned against the rooftops, he set his instruments in a warm line to dry and wrote the day's last notes. Boy with goat, splinter removed, goat more offended than boy. Fisherman's cough, worse on north wind, prescribed fennel. Forbid stories after midnight. Old woman by the well. Pulse like distant drumming. Improves when grandchild laughs. He did not pretend to understand the last one fully, but he wrote it down anyway. The best physicians have always been secret archivists of human oddness. He ate olives, bread, a little cheese, and fruit that tasted exactly as much like the sun as the sun could spare. He lifted his cup to the evening in a gesture that could not possibly make a difference, and probably did. If you find your mind slipping comfortably between barley water and laurel leaves, that is part of the prescription. The doctor's lamp flickered and then committed to the dark, the way sensible lamps do. Outside, the temple doors closed with a noise like a cough politely disguised. The air cooled and became something he would describe tomorrow, with a tongue that always knew a little more than it admitted. He placed the wax tablet on its shelf beside other days that had been carefully folded and put away. Somewhere in town, a shoulder remembered its job. Somewhere a fever asked for shade. Somewhere a student practiced bandaging a wine amphora with more care than any amphora deserves. The doctor looked at the quiet room, listened for a drip that kept faithful time, and decided, without urgency, that he would be ready again at dawn, when the world presented its small negotiations and the body, as predictable as a kind promise, asked to be measured into comfort once more. You might not expect a physician to greet the morning by negotiating with a broom, but the Greek doctor did exactly that. He moved the broom an inch to the left, then an inch back to the right, as if persuading the dust to leave voluntarily. A quiet ritual, mostly for the dust's dignity. He touched the lintel with 2 fingers, one for Asclepius, one for Hygeia, and listened to the courtyard's first sounds. A pigeon practicing one syllable, a jar settling on its shelf, the long vowel of a donkey thinking about breakfast. If you are still awake by the time we reach the debate over whether to boil barley once or twice for winter phlegm, you may subscribe or not. I'll be busy counting pulses against the drip of an amphora and unable to notice either way. He tied his belt with the same knot every day because the body likes predictable conversations with cloth. The lamp by the door claimed a spoonful of oil, just enough for practical hope, not enough for drama. In a glazed bowl, he cooled his fingers in last night's water, which had been flavored, if that's the word, by a sprig of laurel kept there. To impress microbes with good manners, he rubbed a pinch of fine sand across his palms the way a baker rubs flour between his hands when both are considering the day's dough. He sniffed the air the way sailors do, testing which wind held the day's temperament. North wind means dry coughs and arguments. South wind means damp joints and compliant bread. A doctor who knows the wind can write a fair amount of tomorrow before tomorrow arrives. The first knock was rarely a knock. It was a cough rehearsed on the threshold, or the long whisper of sandals from someone who had not decided whether they were sick enough to deserve attention. He greeted people by asking them to sit on the stool whose legs were slightly uneven. He preferred it that way because the patient would immediately tell him which leg offended them most by trying. To compensate for the stool, a farmer came with a son whose nose had taken a philosophical interest in a fig branch. The doctor pressed along the bridge with 2 fingers conversing politely. He set a little wooden splint and bound it with linen narrow enough to look delicate and firm enough to be trustworthy. No sneezing like a hero, he advised, which is a real prescription even now. A baker followed, carrying the question that bakers always carry. Why do my elbows hate the weight of dough more in the month when the olives ripen? The doctor nodded because bodies notice harvest the way dogs notice visitors. He advised a poultice of crushed mint and worm vinegar, applied while telling the elbow about retirement. The baker laughed and paid with a small loaf, too perfect to eat in a hurry. The doctor took one bite anyway. Bread and medicine share a curriculum: warmth, time, patience, and the avoidance of showing off. His bag was a small museum of practical decisions. There was a bronze scalpel that slept in a sheath of soft leather and woke without complaint. Its edge was honest, which is all an edge needs to be. There were bone probes, smooth to a friendliness surprising in tools meant for questioning. Wounds. There were hooks, gentle hooks, really useful for lifting a stubborn piece of skin, the way you lift a curtain edge to ask the room if it's ready. Cupping jars traveled with their own quiet pride, round mouths that left on backs a series of dignified circles like a constellation invented in a hurry. A cautery iron pretended to be shy. He used it more as punctuation than as argument. The bandage basket held linen torn from garments that had already learned their responsibilities. Old cloth, like old friends, is immediately useful. He kept lint collected from clean rags in a little jar, a gray cloud of kindness he carried. Herbs as if they were neighbors. Willow for pain that had opinions. Fennel for stomachs hoping to forgive. Hyssop for coughs that loved attention. Poppy tears, a phrase he enjoyed saying, for nights that needed shorter shadows. He balanced them with vinegar, which believes itself philosophical, and honey, which believes itself eternal, and wine, which believes everything at once. When someone spit out a bitter decoction, he pretended surprise and then added a pinch of something pleasant. The way you bribe a reluctant child with a story about the spoon. Sometimes the work asked for small theater. Bleeding phlebotomy, if you wanted to earn a nod from scrolls, was done with the calm precision of pruning a vine that had gotten above itself. He tied a band gently, found the cooperative line of blue, and let a measured number of drops collect in a shallow bowl. He counted them softly, a shepherd of brief red sheep. There were fevers that loved to be bled, and fevers that only pretended to love it. Experience taught the difference, and failing that, the weather did. Purging likewise were its own choreography. There was the famous hellebore from Antikythera, a drastic negotiator that persuaded the bowels to reconsider their inventory, and gentler laxatives made from figs and patience. The physician kept a goose feather for enemas. Goose feathers do not come up much in heroic poetry, which is probably a kindness to heroic poetry, and chamomile for aftercare, because no matter the century, chamomile is a blanket disguised as a plant. Dentistry presented itself uninvited like a neighbor with a lute. A tooth, offended by time, insisted on leaving. He felt along the jaw, rocked the tooth with the confidence of a man who had rocked many stubborn things into submission and worked with oil to coax rather than conquer. He showed the patient the tooth afterward as if returning a deposit. The patient looked astonished by the size of an object that had lived rent-free for so long. For sore gums, he rubbed myrrh into the margins with the solemnity of a ceremony. Myrrh, always asked to be taken seriously and to be fair, often earns it. Yet beneath instruments and antics sat a philosophy so tidy you could fold it into a pocket. Four hewers, always writing letters to each other. Blood, which likes to throw. Festivals. Phlegm, which prefers winter and honest blankets. Yellow bile, quick-tempered and in charge of opinions. Black bile, a poet with all the usual poet problems. Good health meant their arguments were polite. Illness meant someone had begun to shout. The physician believed that food, drink, sleep, motion, rest, bath, and season were the levers by which you asked the four to use indoor voices. He matched hot with cold, dry with moist, full with empty, effort with repose. You can call this simplistic. If you like, the doctor would answer that advice must fit into a sentence you can remember when you are tired. He read the body the way readers read weather almanacs. The tongue carries a calendar, the urine bowl sunset, the pulse a parade whose speed tells you whether the town is nervous. He watched for crisis days, odd-numbered, often when the illness might declare its intentions. He taught students to see the Hippocratic face, which is not mystical, merely the set of features that ask you to sit quietly. cold nose, hollow eyes, stretched skin, ears that look too interested, a face that asks for gentle voices and fewer visitors. Prognosis was his pride. Anyone can say, "You are ill." He preferred to tell people where the path bends and which shoes to wear. He did not mind living within walking distance of a temple. The Asclepian offered its own remedies. Sleep in the stoa with the serpents and dream a dream that told you what to do. In the morning, write your cure on a tablet so the next sleeper can borrow courage. The physician smiled at these things not with scorn, but with the practical man's gratitude. A quiet night on a clean bed in a courtyard full of hopeful whispers cures more than the cynic remembers. On some afternoons, he even sent a patient there on purpose, especially when the illness lived mostly in worries. "Go sleep where the God meets you politely," he would say, and people found the phrase extremely medical. He was, however, careful with oaths. He promised not to give deadly drugs, which is easier than it sounds because most deadly drugs announce themselves with bitterness and an eagerness to hope. He promised not to perform certain operations that needed more hands and better lighting than he possessed. He promised above all to remember that he did not know everything, which is the most complicated promise a clever person can make. He reminded students that the body is not a field for heroics. It is a field for harvests, for tending, for noticing when one corner ripens after another. He discouraged famous last-minute saves. He encouraged modest daily victories, more sleep, fewer figs at night, sandals that fit. When remedies failed, and they did, blame looked for somewhere to sit. Families blamed the season, a very dignified scapegoat. Priests blamed the household gods for neglect, which had the advantage of being fixable with incense. Neighbors blamed drafts. The physician blamed timing, or perhaps the stomach's stubbornness, or the city's water after a heavy rain. He tried not to blame people, because blame poisons the well of cooperation. He sat with the family and turned work into comfort, washed the body with warm water and a drop of oil. Comb the hair with a good comb. Place rosemary in the hands. Tell the story of the day before the illness began, making it longer than it needs to be. The work studied them. He cleaned his tools with wine and the same gentle attention he would use for sorrow. He kept notes on wax tablets the way a librarian keeps notes on fog. Careful, even when precision seems ambitious. Woman from the fish market, cough prefers. South wind, recommend hyssop and fewer arguments with eels. Boy with pebble in ear, removed with olive oil and patience. Pebble denies wrongdoing. Veteran with shoulder insubordination, traction with stick. Succeeded with satisfying noise. Told him to lift pride later. The tablets held weather, winds, foods, and the surprising effect of a small nap taken at the right moment. Doctors like to believe that tomorrow will consult yesterday. Writing is how we make the introduction. His tools joined him on walks. He taught students how to wrap an ankle so the bandage looks lazy, but is, in fact, vigilant. He showed them the ladder and pole for the shoulder reduction, the famous method, explaining that leverage is just a conversation with stubbornness using furniture. He lectured on fractures, speaking earnestly to bones by way of students, telling them that bones are slow readers who nevertheless finish the book if you give them quiet. He warned sternly against angering joints by twisting them into opinions. He made them pick up a cup of water and carry it across the courtyard without looking at it. The cup and the gate will tell you whether a back is considering rebellion. He loved simple regimen more than complicated decoctions. In winter, more walk during the day and more blanket at night. In summer, more shade, less wine, water that has seen a clay jar for an hour. For melancholy, he recommended moderate work and olives eaten while listening to someone else's cheerful problem. For gluttony, he recommended friends who eat slowly and lamps that burn modestly. He assigned baths at temperatures that encouraged thoughtfulness instead of confidence. He wrote menus that sound like poetry: barley porridge drizzled with the future, greens cooked until they consider cooperation, bread that answers yes when asked to be torn. The city gave him odd errands. During festivals, he supervised the wine-water ratio like a customs inspector. During a drought, he asked people to sleep near the ground and to greet the dawn with lids on their jars, which answers a surprising number of questions. During a heat wave, he walked through alleys teaching the art of the shade map, where the shadow of a fig tree stands at noon, where the eaves protect at 3, which wall lends coolness to backs without asking a favor in return. Shade, he observed, is a medicine the city prescribes to itself. Now and then he met superstition halfway. He allowed amulets for children, not because bronze discs defeat fever, but because fevers dislike children who feel watched over. He taught a tidy version of the evil eye remedy that involved spitting exactly never, and certainly not on the floor of his surgery, but placed a blue thread near the cradle just the same. He nodded at astrologers with kind skepticism. A doctor can work under any sky, and most skies never ask to be thanked. He rejected the fashionable snakestone, but kept a particular shell in his pocket because it reminded him of waves and therefore of breathing slowly. He watched the city change and saw his craft survive mostly by being boring in public and brave in private. He tried battlefields by choosing to clean wounds obsessively, which is both boring and brave. He learned to carry a patient with 2 slings instead of 1, a trick that saved more pain than most speeches. He learned to turn a piece of wine-soaked linen into a tent over a wound to make its air kinder. He learned the nobility of saying, "We will wait," which is not the same as doing nothing. Waiting, performed correctly, is an intervention with a very good bedside manner, and he noticed the little legacies that escaped their century. He noticed that apprentices learned to ask questions in a particular order. When did this begin? What makes it worse? What helps a little that modern students still ask without remembering who taught them? He noticed that families began to organize rooms differently, with a sick bed near a breeze, but not in a draft, with a place for water and a place for quiet, with visitors visiting as if they respected furniture. He noticed that soldiers learned to recognize the sound of their own shoulder returning to work and to feel relieved rather than dramatic. He noticed that the town believed in washing hands without phrasing it that way, as evening thickened, like honey left too long in a cool room. He put away the day. Instruments dried on a cloth that knew this routine. The lamp considered a last flame and decided against it. The courtyard smelled of time and responsible smoke. He ate bread, olives, a fig that tasted ridiculously of sunlight, and a sliver of cheese that pretended to be an argument. He sipped watered wine and wrote, one more time, the wind's decision and what it had done to coughs. He admitted to the wax tablet that he did not understand why the old woman by the mill slept better with a cat on her knees. He simply recorded that a cat on the knees is a reasonable prescription in cases of worrying at midnight, if you have drifted a little during the inventory of tools and humors. That is correct technique. The doctor's day does not end or begin so much as it folds linen over linen, routine over routine. Somewhere in the dark, pulse kept a tidy beat against someone's fingers. Somewhere a child with a blue thread slept without bargaining. Somewhere a jar cooled the water exactly as promised. He set the broom back where it preferred to stand, a courtesy to the morning. He lay down under a sky that made a very slow argument for silence, and he thought, in the gentle grammar of a man who has seen enough days to suspect tomorrow will behave. Wind from the north, soups for lunch, splints ready, patience on the shelf beside the laurel. Then, without any fuss at all, the physician kept the kindest appointment in medicine and slept. You might not expect a professional healer to keep a jar of barley beside a bowl of holy water and a length of blue thread, but there it sat on the shelf, the three of them getting along politely like roommates who never learned each other's. Last names. The doctor would touch each item as he opened for the day, not because the city required it, but because habits are a kind of quiet treaty with the morning. If you remain awake long enough to hear about the proper number of knots, on a protective cord there is an answer, and it is pleasingly arbitrary. You may subscribe or not. The barley will continue to be barley, and the thread will keep being blue, quite without assistance. He began with the sensible things first because it calms the furniture. He swept the threshold so the dust could not claim squatters' rights, washed his hands in water cooled in a clay jar, and chewed a leaf of fennel as if it were a conversation starter. He set out his cupping jars and the neat bronze scalpel that disliked flamboyance. Then, with a different kind of attention, he nudged the small dish of salt to the center of the table. It was ordinary salt, but ordinary salt behaves solemnly when a doctor is looking. Sometimes he added a pinch to water and drew a small circle with his finger before examining the patient. No one could prove it helped, and yet it kept happening, the way you keep patting your coat for a key that is, in fact, in the keyhole dot. The first visitor described a fever that rose at sunset like a punctual actor. The doctor listened to the tongue, the eyes, the pulse, to all the modest witnesses. He advised cool cloths, thin gruel, and a stern lecture to blankets. Then the patient asked the question people ask when they want 2 cures for the price of 1. Should I also sleep in the temple? The doctor nodded. Practical measures for the body, ritual sleep for the mind. The Asclepian offered a bed in the Stoa, a serpent or 2 practicing silence, and a sacred dog with an advanced degree in licking. Dreams would work the night shift. He wrote a note for the priests: eat lightly, bathe, listen for a dream that gives instructions with the confidence of an uncle, and sent the man away carrying both a regimen and a hope, which together weigh less than either alone. A woman came next with knotted pain in her ribs, the kind that hides under laughter and jumps out during chores. The doctor measured her breath with his hand, then measured it a second time in case time had improved it. He rubbed oil mixed with pennyroyal along the aching line and laid a warm compress where arguments were loudest. Then, noticing the way, her fingers worried the edge of her cloak, he offered a thread, blue as modest sky. 7 knots? She asked, testing him. 9, he said. 9 is a tidy number. It does not hurry. She smiled the smile of someone who understands that a ritual can be a handle. She tied the knots and felt, quite genuinely, that her pain had been encouraged to behave. If anyone had demanded a footnote, the footnote would have said, "The mind appreciates participation." At the edge of the courtyard, a boy traded rumors with the pigeons. He had brought a statue foot, clay and carefully shaped, dedicated for the ankle of Philin healed. In the temple, such feet accumulate by the dozen, along with clay ears, clay hands, clay livers that look like difficult bread. He held it out to the doctor as if showing a cousin. The doctor admired the workmanship and said, "Feet that have been thanked usually continue to cooperate." It was exactly the kind of sentence that makes pigeons agree enthusiastically. There was a day each month when he opened the jar of sulfur with the seriousness reserved for weather forecasts. The city feared bad air, miasma, the invisible discourtesy that curled through alleys after floods and festivals. So he fumigated the surgery, a little sulfur, a little laurel, a pinch of frankincense if the purse boasted extra coins. Smoke walked around the room as if checking the corners for misbehavior. Even the tools enjoyed it, sitting straighter on the table, the bronze adopting a faintly ceremonial shine. Was this science? Was it a blessing? It smelled like both, and sometimes a smell is a solution disguised as perfume. He had colleagues who refused all ritual on principle, men who kept their scrolls arranged by indignation and considered temple sleep a hobby for anxious pillows. He also knew men who would not lance a boil until the moon agreed to supervise. Our doctor walked between the two, a narrow path that passes conveniently near the pantry. He could explain fevers using humors, winds, and habits, and he could also trace a little sign on the water bowl if a child found that comforting. He liked to say that a remedy should work twice, once in the body and once in the room dot at noon. He welcomed a midwife to share his table. She reported births like a poet reports sunsets, each fundamentally similar, each surprisingly particular. They compared notes on garlic tests and barley tests, on the way a woman's pulse speaks softly about hidden futures, on the stubbornness of breeches and the persuasive power of singing. The midwife wore a bronze charm shaped like a tiny hand. "For luck?" he asked. "For companionship," she said, and drank the rest of her water with the air of someone who has earned it. When she rose, he slipped the blue thread box a little closer to her basket without comment, and she accepted it without gratitude, which is the most elegant form of gratitude. The afternoon brought an older fisherman with knees that had become historians. The doctor warmed towels, applied them, and kneaded carefully until the joint released a small, satisfied rumor. He then fetched a thin lead tablet and scratched. A promise on it: "I will not quarrel with letters." He rolled it up, tied it to the fisherman's belt, and told him to laugh at it once a day. "Mockery is a mild medicine," he observed, and the fisherman, who had been laughing at the sea for 40 years, approved the plan. The tablet was not magic. It was a reminder with weight, the kind of reminder that does not lose arguments. With pockets. As the day slowed, students gathered to hear the story they kept asking for, the one about mixing the respectable with the inexplicable. He told them about the cock Socrates owed to Asclepius, a debt paid for the cure of lives. Fever, and watched their faces tilt into thought. He told them about the country Atramantis, the healer-seer who learned herbs from hillsides and dreams from caves, a man who could set a bone and also tell you which star was currently fond of your spleen. He told them about the mothers who believed firmly in washing hands and tying amulets. They were rarely wrong about either. "Your work," he said gently, "is to know what you know, and also to know when a gesture does more than a lecture." He set a bowl of water between them and sprinkled salt into it with an unnecessary flourish, because students enjoy a little theater even when they swear they do not. He asked them to watch how the grains disappear and to consider how many worries can be dissolved with kindness, coolness, and time. He taught them that when a patient spits out a bitter decoction, adding honey is not superstition but strategy. Sweetness negotiates with willpower better than sermons do. He reviewed the alphabet. Of pulses, the meanings of urine colors, the voice of the fever that rises at night out of habit. Then, as a reward for all that ordinary attention, he told them a story from the temple inscriptions. A man whose dream prescribed a bath in cold water, followed by running backward around the altar, which cured him of a limp, or at least improved his sense of rhythm. "We place these stories in the cupboard," he said, "and take them down when a cupboard is precisely what is needed." When night came with its slow broom, the temple began its shift. People entered quietly the way you enter a library or an argument with someone you love. They washed, they ate the plain food that makes dreams behave, and they lay down on pallets where dozens had already slipped their questions into the floor. Priests moved like courteous shadows. A snake wrote a few looping sentences across the tiles and retired from literature. The dream would do its work the way yeast works, invisibly and with a tidy schedule. In the morning, the doctor would read the inscription of whatever cure had been granted and translate it into the grammar of regimen. Walk at dawn. Drink water that has met a clay jar. speak kindly to soup. There were failures too, quiet ones. A man drank the temple water and the lime leached from the stone disagreed with him. The doctor treated the disagreeableness and added a note to his list of things to remember. A mother tied so many amulets to her child that the child could not nap. He carefully reduced the jewelry to 2 items and declared them dramatically sufficient. An apprentice burned too much sulfur and the room smelled like an argument for days. He measured the next fumigation with the humility that follows enthusiasm. Out in the streets, people managed their own mixtures. A merchant refused to sign a contract on a day that had angered Mars last year and nevertheless took his barley broth exactly as prescribed. A soldier swore an oath to keep his bandage dry and then invited the god to notice his good behavior, a savvy combination of compliance and public relations. A girl with a stubborn cough wore a tiny bronze figure of Hygeia and also learned to sip warm water between sentences. No one thought this confused, it was simply thorough. The doctor kept one rule as both compass and pillow. Nothing that harms the body gets to stay just because it comforts the mind, and nothing that harms the mind gets to stay just because it looks tidy in a scroll. With that, he let the 2 schools share a bench. He let logic arrange the dosages and ritual arrange the silence around the bed. He let the temple teach patience and his garden teach digestion. He let the amulet be an excellent reminder to take. The medicine an excellent reminder that reminders are not enough. On warm evenings, he closed the day with a small procession of chores that looked suspiciously like prayers. He rinsed the cups, wiped the table, loosened the lid of the barley jar so it would not sulk tomorrow. He returned the blue thread to its box, where stray strands curled like question marks trying to be cats. He touched the doorframe again, one finger for Asclepius, one for Hygeia, and stepped into the street where the city's own rituals continued. Lamps waking up, Brett traveling home, the moon demonstrating that repetition can be deeply reassuring. In the end, the mixing looked less like confusion and more like embroidery. The sensible remedies formed the cloth: barley, baths, sleep, walking, poultices, the honest blade. The rituals stitched the edges so the cloth would not fray under fear. You could remove the stitching and the cloth would still be cloth. You could remove the cloth and find yourself holding thread with nowhere to sit. Together, they made something that outlasted fashions and arguments and even faintly centuries. Students went on to be careful in their shops and modest in their miracles. Families learned that a clean bed and a hopeful gesture are complementary rather than competitive. Priests had collected tablets inscribed with gratitude and, occasionally, with spelling that cured no one that pleased the stone if you have drifted. A little while the smoke toured the room, and the thread learned not to hurry. That is appropriate. This part of history was designed to be slightly boring on purpose. A fever lowered not dramatically, but the way a voice lowers at dusk. A pain behaved after oil persuaded it to try good manners. A dream offered advice that translated after breakfast into drinking water and not quarreling with ladders. The doctor stacked his tools in the same order he always had: the practical row, the hopeful row, and the night arranged itself around sleepy houses and clean jars. Somewhere the temple scribe sharpened his stylus to record that yet another man had been told to walk backward 3 times and then forward forever. And somewhere the physician smiled, because ordinary forward is almost always the best part of the cure. You might not expect a physician to begin the day by counting how many times a clay jar has sighed in the night, but that is what the jar does when the air cools and warms again. Tiny clicks along the rim, like polite applause for dawn. Our Greek doctor listens from the doorway as if the jar is an assistant taking attendance. The courtyard smells faintly of olive wood and the kind of smoke that wants to be helpful. If you are still awake a few minutes from now, After we've discussed the social life of bronze hooks and why a spoon sometimes goes to a temple, you may subscribe or not. The jar will go on sighing at its own agreeable pace. He opens the practice, with gestures that are not quite sacred and not quite housekeeping. The broom knows the path, from threshold to bench to the step where shoes hesitate. He ladles water from a cool amphora, and the bowl gives back a round face that is half him and half the room. There is a shelf for the ordinary tools bandages, stacked like folded ideas, a mortar that remembers what it crushed yesterday, and 2 scales that barely speak but always agree. There are also little concessions to the gods, a sprig of laurel that refuses to wilt out of respect, and a small terracotta foot left by a grateful patient who clearly believed that the foot, like most of us, needed its own publicity. He chews a bit of fennel and calls it breakfast, which seems to satisfy both the mouth and the calendar. Before the street is fully awake, the first patients have already begun to cue themselves in a way that suggests they have practiced cueing in more difficult places such as markets and families. Villagers make the trip early, a habit shared by soldiers on leave and by elders who prefer to be seen by the sun as well as by the physician. He greets them one by one. The shepherd's daughter with the wrist that learned from a rambunctious lamb, the baker whose knees complain whenever grain prices do, the fisherman who says the sea and his stomach are negotiating a treaty. He examines tongues that insist on telling the truth, the whites of eyes that believe in weather, and pulses that behave like shy animals present, responsive and quick to pretend otherwise if anyone claps. He prefers simple interventions first, not due to modesty, but because simple things are easier for households to keep doing. Water warmed by the afternoon, barley made patient by slow boiling, a bit of oil rubbed where muscles misremember their job descriptions. He encouraged walking that does not compete with thinking, and sleeping that remembers to be sleep, not philosophy. On some mornings, he writes a note for the Asclepian priest, a courteous referral that reads like a travel itinerary for the mind. Bathe, lie down beneath the colonnade, let the sacred snakes perform their quiet choreography, and notice what the dream says when it finally stops trying to be clever. By mid-morning, the instruments begin their long, soft conversations. A bronze scalpel sees daylight and becomes formal. Hooks of different sizes, more like shepherds for tissue than pirates, line themselves in order, because hooks dislike improvisation. A spicillum, which is a fancy word for a slender probe that minds its manners, receives a bit of oil and pretends not to enjoy it. Cupping jars wait like small, transparent arguments ready to be applied and then withdrawn, leaving round marks that tell the story of a visit without giving away secrets. There is a blunt-nosed spoon, not for soup, which worries people at first, but for applying ointments where ointments would otherwise be shy. If someone were to label each item with the day's mood, cautious, optimistic, decisive, the labels would probably stick. Not all cures are tidy. Bleeding has a way of being melodramatic, even when performed with restraint, so he treats it like lighting a lamp, the smallest necessary flame for the darkest necessary corner. He favors leeches less than rumor suggests and prefers a controlled incision, the bowl placed beneath as if catching an argument before it starts. Purging is equally unglamorous. He prescribes hellebore for constipation, but only when patience has already tried its best, and he reminds people that hellebore is a plant with a lively personality. A gentler purge figs, warm water, and a walk that is slightly longer than gossip usually permits often proves persuasive. Enemas are considered medicine rather than conversation topics, although occasionally the amphora used for the purpose gets painted with vines, perhaps to cheer everyone up. They're a stranger. Remedies that insist on attending the meeting. Spiderweb to pack a wound, partly for its texture and partly because old webs know stories about staying put. smoked goat dung, the kind collected from a particular stall after a particular festival finds its way into a formula for coughs. Not because it is glamorous, but because someone's aunt swore it worked and then lived long enough to be insistent. Vinegar and honey arrive together, a small alliance known to soldiers as oxynol and to throats as kindness. When the doctor prescribes a plaster of wine-soaked bread and crushed herbs, the patient always looks briefly hopeful, as if dinner might be involved. It is not dinner, but the skin eats gratefully anyway. A microdrama unfolds when a soldier limps in with a wound that wishes to audition for tragedy. The doctor cleans it with warm water, honey, and thyme, the last being the most expensive ingredient, which he provides for free. He stitches with linen thread drawn through beeswax so it will behave. He places a small laurel leaf beside the dressing. There is no rule about this leaf, and yet the leaf keeps appearing, like a low voice agreeing in the background. He tells the soldier to return tomorrow, and the soldier looks surprised, as if healing could be a place you visit more than once. The doctor says gently that most things are. Between patients he lectures the apprentices. They stand like well-meaning columns and absorb principles that are about as exciting as bread and just as necessary. There are 4 humors, he reminds them, and they do not like to be hurried into balance. Blood is forward, yellow bile opinionated, black bile literary, and phlegm endlessly reasonable. He describes the seasons and how they push the humors around like hosts rearranging chairs after guests arrive. He gestures at the sky in its practical capacity as climate and its metaphysical hobby as mood board. He speaks about regimen as if it were a friendly governor: exercise, diet, sleep, bathing, quiet policies that keep a body from needing dramatic laws. A student asks whether the gods approve of barley. He replies that the gods tend to approve of what is moderate and tidy, and that barley has never in recorded history started a riot. Another student wonders if one should trust dreams. The doctor says dreams are like well-meaning relatives. They often suggest helpful things, but their advice improves when translated into smaller steps. If a dream prescribes a 7-day fast followed by running backward around an altar, he turns it into lighter meals and a stroll at dawn, forward as a courtesy to ankles. Rational explanations do much of the work, yet ritual keeps hanging up. It's cloaked by the door and sitting down anyway. When a child arrives with night terrors, the doctor does not debate ontology. He gives the child a sachet stuffed with rosemary and anise, because sleeping near good smells is a form of bravery. He demonstrates how to tie a blue thread around a wrist 9 knots for slow luck and tells the mother that the thread will remind the child to count breaths. A man with a stubborn cough presents a lid curse tablet he claims to have raised against the cough itself. The doctor skims the text, admires the handwriting, and recommends warm water between sentences. Neither cure cancels the other. The superstitious gestures are small boats. The regimen is the river that carries them. Noon brings a lull fit for philosophy. The physician sits in the shade and reads lines from a scroll that may be Hippocrates or merely someone who writes with Hippocrates' temper. The text insists that disease has causes that walk among us: air, water, place, and the situations. We keep inviting to dinner. He nods along. The marsh breeds fevers that prefer dusk. The wind off the west hills unbuttons throats. The city's drains are an ongoing discussion. He copies a sentence for the students. What remains to be discovered will be discovered by those who attend to what is near. It is not thrilling advice, but it keeps more people alive than thrilling advice does. When work resumes, a woman arrives whose hands ache from weaving. He warms oil with rosemary and teaches her to rest the shuttle on her thigh between passes to spare the small bones the duty of heroism. He bandages a market porter's shoulder and prescribes figs, along with the difficult instruction to ask for help when a sack looks too proud. He counsels a young man who has read too many poets and declares himself ill with unrequitedness. The doctor tells him to avoid lyre playing after sunset and to consider writing to the beloved in the form of a shopping list. The young man returns a week later with an actual shopping list in fewer size. Because people bring problems that are, in fact, invitations to invent devices, the practice accumulates tools that would make a carpenter wonder. There's a hinged splint for fingers, a padded stick for biting during unpleasantness, and a small hand wrench meant to persuade dislocated shoulders to forgive and return. He keeps a frame for drying herbs in neat little bunches. They learn patience by watching one another wither politely. In a chest, he stores pessaries shaped like plausible excuses to be soaked in medicated oil and employed where an argument needs to be made gently and locally. The chest has a false bottom, less for secrecy than for tidiness, and beneath it lie a few items he rarely uses: a cautery iron in case the bleeding will not accept negotiations, and a saw that he hopes will remain a rumor. Sometimes the doctor travels beyond the city. In the hills, he visits a village whose well has become unfriendly. He stands near it and listens to the frogs in a neighboring ditch, because frogs are local experts. He advises the villagers to move the waste heap farther from the water and to stop washing wool in the same spot where children practice floating. He shows them how to spread fired limestone in a shallow channel to keep runoff from soaking into. The well, the advice is not complicated. It simply prefers being repeated every spring. He leaves behind a short inscription scratched on a potsherd. Water likes to be clean enough to see itself. The day contains shadows. A man arrives too late with a fever that has memorized him. The doctor cools the body and speaks softly to the family, telling them what to do in the night if the breath begins to forget. He does not promise, and he does not despair. He just organizes blankets and water and a chair for watching. There is a case that refuses to respond after honest attempts, a woman whose belly keeps swelling like a slow argument. He tries diet, rest, gentle purges, prayers offered by someone who knows what to say, and he tries leaving it all alone for a fortnight to see if the body wants a chance to rehearse. When she dies, the midwife sits with him in the empty courtyard and points out the order of the stars. The sky has always been an expert at condolence because it repeats itself without making a scene. When treatment fails without courtesy, the question of blame wanders in. Families ask softly whether the physician erred, whether the gods were offended, or whether the illness carried a letter already written. The doctor keeps all three answers in a small mental drawer labeled "not." Incompatible. He reviews his notes, apologizes to no one or to everyone as appropriate, and adjusts his habits like a man trimming a lamp wick. In the temple, someone pens a tablet naming him, the gods, and fate as co-authors of the outcome. The order of the names shifts with the mood, which is as fair as anything. Even without triumph, the day finds ways to end kindly. He returns instruments to their places as if returning books to a library that trusts him. He rinses the jars, leaving a single drop in each to remind tomorrow how to begin. He marks a few observations on a wax tablet. Small boy with cough improves when he drinks warm water after speaking. Shoulder persuaded with gentle traction. Widow insists that soup prefers clockwise stirring. Agree for morale. These notes are not for posterity, but for his mourning self, who appreciates such messages from yesterday the way travelers appreciate inns. Before closing, he recites a little oath, not the famous one, which likes to dress in ceremony, but a personal string of promises about not guessing when measuring would do, not frightening anyone for sport, and not allowing the broom to feel unnecessary. The shadows are also memories. He was once a battlefield physician, and in a pinch he can still turn a cloak into a sling in the time it takes a charioteer to finish a sentence. He knows how to use wine to clean and how to talk a panicked friend into breathing like a person rather than like a sequence of disasters. These habits do not advertise themselves in the city practice, but they keep a certain steadiness nearby, the way a weight keeps a tablecloth from sulking in a breeze. When a traveler collapses in the street, he appears with a composure that looks like courage and is in fact rehearsal. People sometimes ask what the legacy of all this is meant to be. He shrugs in the polite Greek manner that suggests an essay he will not be writing today. Perhaps it is healthier kitchens, where pots learn to boil thoroughly and hands learn to wash for reasons that are practical and slightly theatrical. Perhaps it is the habit of walking at daybreak, not because one has vowed to, but because dawn makes promises that noon cannot keep. Perhaps it is scrolls copied and recopied, filled not only with theories that age like wine and vinegar, but also with tiny details that age like bread, the right size of compress for a child's forehead, the number of steps between bed and door when someone needs to step outside quickly. There is, too, the unexpected way Greek doctors taught the idea that healing often consists of noticing the obvious and doing it consistently, which is both disappointing and comforting. Clean water, shaded rest, fruit in season, baths that negotiate with muscles, linen that forgives, conversation that does not scold. When later ages announce breakthroughs with trumpets, these older, smaller truths keep attending to people in kitchens and courtyards without insisting on applause. The temple traditions persist as well, not merely as superstition, but as proof that the mind likes a ceremony, the way doors like a handle. Near the end of the evening, he stops by the Asclepieion. The colonnade is quiet except for the soft opinions of doves. He reads the new tablets hung today. A man cured of insomnia after dreaming that he should sleep with his left foot touching a warm brick. A woman freed from pain by bathing before sunrise for 7 mornings while scolding the sea. She reports the sea took it well. A boy who stuttered until he began to recite the alphabet backward to a patient dog. He copies a few lines, amused at how easily such advice becomes regimen, warm feet, fresh air, practice, companionship. Before leaving, he places a small dish of figs at the altar, a modest bribe which everyone pretends is not a bribe. At home, he coaches his own body through its closing procedures. He eats olives with bread that has forgotten to be warm and drinks water that remembers the jar. He looks at the sky and admits that the moon has also been a physician tonight, classifying worries by size. He rubs oil onto his hands, the hands that have spent the day arguing gently with tendons and persuasion, and tells them, out loud, that they may rest. He sets the blue thread on the table, not because he plans to tie it to anything, but because sometimes the sight of a neat coil is as calming as the coil itself. If you are still here, drifting between the sound of the broom and the thought of laurel leaves, consider how many ordinary objects have been promoted during this long, quiet day, bowls becoming counselors, jars becoming thermometers by personality, hooks that behave, compresses that recall the temperature of kindness, a regimen that is not a punishment but a long conversation with sunlight, water, and bread. The doctor will rise tomorrow to the same sighing jar, the same shelf of instruments with proper manners, the same mix of reason and ritual that makes houses sleep easier. Somewhere in the city, a patient rolls over, finds the cool spot on the pillow, and decides that the dream can speak later. The night approves, as it often does, by looking exactly like itself and taking a long, patient breath. You might not expect a doctor to begin the day by listening to a clay jar, yet here he is, ear tilted toward the amphora, like a gossip-hungry bird, counting the small pops the pottery makes as dawn cools the water inside. The jar is an uncomplicated instrument that only tells the truth. The night was mild, the morning cooperative, and the clinic may proceed without theatrical fevers. If you're still awake by the time we reach the part where goat fat and rose oil become colleagues, feel free to subscribe. Or to do nothing at all idleness is an ancient remedy, and I would never argue with a remedy that requires no equipment. The physician rubs his hands with olive oil that smells faintly of last year's hillside and steps into the courtyard, which is rehearsing birdsong as if the neighbors might greet it. He starts with tidying that is half ritual, half dust management. The floor receives a sweep, the broom trailing a patient line that even ants respect. He lifts the little terracotta votive, a foot with an exaggerated arch, a gift from someone whose ankle forgave them, and sets it by the door, facing outward so it can watch for success. There is an altar stone no bigger than a bread loaf. On it he places a sprig of laurel and a thimble of wine for the god of healing, who appreciates small portions and good manners. He nods toward the kitchen, where barley water simmers into a drink that tastes like an argument between soup and rain. In the corner, the scales warm themselves by being precisely symmetrical. The weights sit like obedient moons. He tests a pair of bronze forceps and smiles when they answer with a sing-song click, an instrument's version of present. By the time the clinic smells like clean clay, Dawn has installed a line of patients. Villagers arrive early because villages always do. The shepherd boy with the knee that learned too much from a slope. The weaver who carries her loom in her shoulders. The farmer who is certain his spleen has opinions about grain prices. The baker who simply needs someone to tell him he may sit. Then come the soldiers, performed casually in their off-duty tunics, each one walking with a stride, designed to negotiate pain without confessing it, and then a single aristocrat who believes the sun is an accessory. Our doctor greets each with the same temperature of voice. He sits on a stool worn smooth by outcomes and asks questions that are older than writing. When did it begin? What helps? What makes it choose to be worse? He watches the eyes, the nails, the tongue. These body parts are alarmingly honest and cannot keep household secrets. First appointments are gentle. He prescribes a slow walk for the calf that forgot how to lengthen, a compress for the eye that found dust and kept it out of loyalty, and barley gruel for a stomach that believes in theater. With aristocrats, he is bolder in tone but identical in practice. Warm water, moderation in wine, figs if the season agrees, and sleep that starts before the moon begins whispering errands. He writes a note to the priest at the Asclepian, a polite referral consisting mostly of verbs: bathe, fast a little, dream under the colonnade, and listen for hints that are friendlier than prophecies. The soldier with the blade cut receives honey and munin and the words, tomorrow again, because tomorrow is a treatment the clinic stocks in abundance. Once the courtyard has decided it's morning, the instruments come out to admire the light. Bronze scalpels bask just enough to feel important. A row of little hooks line themselves from smallest to largest, the way siblings do when grandparents visit. A slender probe, the specillum gets a wipe of oil and a reminder not to act superior, merely because it is bilingual in anatomy and curiosity. Cupping cups wait upside down like humble domes, knowing their moment will produce round, moonish marks that village boys will compare with pride. There's a spoon not meant for soup but for ointment, because ointments can be shy and prefer an escort. On the herb shelf, thyme nods to pennyroyal, mint nods to oregano, and hellebore refuses to nod to anyone. He crushes dried bay with a seriousness that would suit a treaty and drops the powder into oil to wake it. Today brings a boy with a swollen finger that believes itself to be the size of a city. The doctor worms the finger over steam and teases the trapped pus into telling the truth. A woman arrives with a headache that lives behind the eyes like an overzealous librarian. He rubs her temples with diluted vinegar and shows her the exercise in which the shoulders remember that they are not jaws. An elderly man complains that his feet feel too full of feet. The physician smiles and prescribes a foot bath scented, with rue and a promise to spend an afternoon not inspecting other people's business at the Agra. He hands the man a small sachet of lavender and says it is for courage at night. Lavender is a plant specialized in small bravery. There are less charming procedures. He performs them without ceremony and exactly as if they were chores anyone might do. Bleeding, when necessary, is a vote of no confidence in excess. He locates a vein that has opinions, opens it a little, and catches the dark out of blood in a bowl that could just as easily hold olives. He watches the patient's face more closely than the bowl. Purging is a negotiation between the body and its enthusiasm for food. He prefers soft persuasion figs, warm water, a half day of quiet. When loud persuasion is demanded, he uses a measured draught of hellebore, ancient medicine with the personality of a governor. He measures thrice because governors should be kept on their leashes. Cupping creates a quiet constellation on a soldier's back. When the cups lift away, each circle says, "We were here," in a tone so polite it might be an apology. Some cures lean into the encyclopedic. Honey, the physician's friend, arrives as a bandage that tastes of summer and refuses decay. Wine becomes an antiseptic by pretending to be sociable. Vinegar joins it to form oximo, a syrup that convinces coughs they have better appointments. Elsewhere, he swats away a fly and folds a spider web into a cut with the confidence of someone who respects spiders as textile artists. He prepares a poultice of bread soaked in wine, crushed with garlic and a herb that grew while ignoring instructions, then spreads it across a swollen knee with the concentration of a fine cook and the bedside manner of a librarian shelving a book that has yelled that afternoons belong to explanations. Apprentices cluster like respectful storks and listen while he outlines the body's weather report. 4 humors blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile each with its preferred season, temperament, and talent for causing poems. Blood likes spring and being loud. Yellow bile believes in summer and sarcasm. Black bile prefers autumn and literature. Phlegm is a winter philosopher who would like everyone to please calm down. Disease, he says, is not a scandal but an imbalance, and the correct response is not panic but measuring. He sketches a chart of seasons and winds, adds foods to each as if filling a pantry, and reminds the students that a man in winter, eating figs as though they were a strategy, will end up negotiating with phlegm. He is practical about dreams and omens. When a patient reports dreaming of a snake coiling around the left ankle, the physician interprets it less as a prophecy and more as a suggestion to stop favoring the right side when walking uphill. He appreciates the temple's medicine not as a competitor but as a colleague who prefers metaphors. Incubation, the sleeping in sacred halls to harvest helpful dreams, pairs neatly with diets and compresses. He tells the apprentices to value habits over heroics, a rule that also improves kitchens. He quotes a line he attributes to Hippocrates, or to common sense. What helps next month is the thing a person can keep doing. Then he demonstrates how to fold a bandage so that it looks as if it were born folded. The city remains a laboratory. He advises the council to stop throwing refuse where the river drinks and to move the tanneries downwind, and is delighted to see that the wind continues to ignore the council and obey physics. He points out that fever increases after certain winds and that the marsh's song grows louder just before headaches become fashionable. He has a small, almost impolite conviction that air matters. He is neither the first nor the last to think so. He keeps notes, unwaxed tablets that read like weather poems with medical footnotes. Dust today. Legs unhappy, barley willing, infants calm after baths. The moon refuses to comment. Not every cure stays within the fence of reason. A mother insists that her child's nightmares require a charm. The doctor gives her a blue thread and shows her how to tie 9 small knots while reciting the alphabet sideways. This is unlikely to harm and quite likely to entertain the child. A merchant arrives with a lead tablet etched with a curse he commissioned against his asthma. The physician, who cannot endorse litigation against lungs, recommends warm water and paced walking, then admires the handwriting and returns the tablet carefully, as one returns an aunt's recipe. He has learned that when people perform little ceremonies, they remember to pay attention. And attention, embarrassingly, often improves things by itself. Failure arrives with an unhurried step. When a fever refuses to negotiate and the patient's breath thins like a thread running out, the physician sits with the family. He does not authorize despair and does not forbid it. He fetches water, explains what to expect without theatricality, and reminds them that the body is doing the best it can in the circumstances. Afterward, Blame wanders the street in search of a home. Was it hubris to hope? Did the gods want something more expensive than laurel and a small cup? Did the physician choose the wrong herb, the wrong season, the wrong tone of voice? He answers by cleaning his tools very carefully, by returning the room to order, and by writing a line on his tablet that is both a confession and a plan. Next time, earlier honey, less heat. Speak to the ant who knows the hours of wind. There are small courtroom scenes no one advertises. A family insists upon a second opinion from a cousin who swears by garlic and bad temper. The cousin is invited, grumbles at the sight of polite instruments, and finally admits that the wound is closing. A temple attendant asks whether the doctor's poultices interfere with dreams. He promises they do not, and that if a dream prescribes an onion, he will fold the onion respectfully into the plan. A magistrate wants to know whether the physician caused a death with an enema. The physician lists the patient's habits, the duration of the illness, the amount of water used, the temperature of the bath, and the opinions of the neighbors. Chickens presented in chronological order. Everyone grows tired and quietly agrees that the gods, the weather, and the patient's fondness for late-night figs share responsibility between them. Like 3 unhurried bureaucrats dot another patient, arrives from the countryside with a shoulder that has relocated. The doctor hangs a small stone from the wrist, persuading the arm to remember gravity correctly. He sings a counting rhyme meant for children because the body responds to rhythm more willingly than to orders. The joint slides home with a muffled sound like a polite jar setting itself on a shelf. He bandages the shoulder and prescribes a week of not arguing with amphory. The man nods solemnly and immediately attempts to lift the bench as proof of improvement. The doctor confiscates the bench with a smile and replaces it with a light stool, which is what progress looks like after lunch. There is a visit to the Asclepian just before dusk, when the marble does its favorite trick glancing moonlight. Back into the world is permission. The doctor reads the Ayamada, inscriptions recording cures. A woman cured of lameness after dreaming. She should toss her sandals into the sea and purchase new ones, a treatment that pleases the sandal maker. And the goddess of tidy endings. A man whose eye cleared when he rubbed it with a feather soaked in wine one suspects the feather did the encouraging, and the wine did the disinfecting. A child freed from stuttering after whispering the alphabet to a temple dog for 7 nights, thereby mastering not only speech but diplomacy. He copies a few cases into his tablet, not as proof, but as recipes for Hope.Night and Bites inventory. He polishes the bronze until it reflects a mild, reasonable moon. He wraps the leeches in damp linen as if tucking in argumentative guests. He checks the herb frame, where bundles of oregano and marjoram dry like old proverbs. He sharpens the scalpel even if he does not expect to cut tomorrow. Preparedness is a superstition he can endorse. He calculates the cost of oil versus the cost of complaints and decides, bravely, to buy good oil anyway. He drinks water that remembers the jar and chews olives that have traveled courteously from a friend's trees. He writes a final note for the morning. Ask the fisherman about the wind. Teach the weaver to rest the shuttle on her thigh. Remind the baker that bread also eats fire, time, and patience. What remains of the day is the quiet legacy no inscription bothers to mention. Greek doctors perfected the art of boring advice, delivered tenderly. Clean water is better than impressive speeches. A shaded nap often outperforms a lecture. A body doing ordinary things on a schedule is a miracle with small lettering. He taught families to boil what could be boiled, to open windows when winds were friendly, to distrust food that had ideas, and to walk while the street was still practicing light. He taught apprentices to measure first and guess later, to write down what was obvious and to pretend that tidiness was divine. He taught towns to trust drains more than prayers, and then to pray anyway because people are not drains. War keeps his skills close by, whether or not the city is arguing with anyone. At the moment, on the battlefield, he learned to turn cloaks into slings and slings into reasons to live until tomorrow. He learned that wine cleans, that honey persuades, that vinegar cancels, that water remembers. He learned the soothing science of rhythm press. Release, press, release, when a chest forgets how to be a bellows. He learned to speak in sentences that are exactly one breath long, because that is what wounded men can listen to. Back in the city, those habits make him look brave when he is only practiced. A child falls in the square. He appears. The child is upright again, as if lifted by rehearsal. If a later age asks what these physicians handed down besides scrolls that smell like libraries, the answer is a catalog of small, consistent mercies. They normalize talking to patients as if patients might understand. They domesticated fear by giving it chores, count this pulse, heat this water, tie this bandage, tell me the dream. They insisted that kitchens were clinics in disguise and that the laundress was secretly part of the staff. They smuggled order into households, one folded compress at a time. And they taught that even when cures are insufficient, kindness counts toward the vital signs. The last appointment of the day belongs to the city itself. He walks home along streets that cool slowly, past doorways where families eat dinner as if dinner were a respectful ritual instead of a negotiation. He answers a question about fungus on a fig tree with an authority that surprises no one. He adds a pebble to a little pile by the crossroads, a private superstition that keeps him from debating with shadows. He covers a sleeping child with a shawl because a mother asked him to and because he is passing by. And finally, he sits on his step and inspects his own pulses like a colleague. They tell him things he already knew. He is tired. He is pleased. The day wishes to be done. If you are still listening, still considering the temperature of barley water and the diplomacy of laurel leaves, you may think of the little clay jar. Again, it cools the water very slowly, just as advice cools worry very slowly. And in the morning, it will make those tiny pops, which are nothing more than air changing its mind. The clinic will open. The scales will balance for sport. The blue thread will wait for a wrist. Somewhere a soldier will practice walking like a person who has not been introduced to pain. Somewhere an apprentice will rewrite a note in neater. Letters because neatness, too, is a kind of remedy. The physician will set out the spoon, the probe, the honey, and the patience, and he will call it a day, and then another day, until the city remembers how to sleep on purpose, and the night, which has been patiently holding its breath, finally lets it go.